All right, everyone. So we're on to topic 7.7. Today we're going to talk about conducting World War II. And while there is a lot of things to unpack about conducting World War II, again, I'm not going to get into the super specifics about how the war was won, but I will talk about broad overviews and historical trends that do play a significant role in why the war was won by the Allied forces. Now, I've linked some videos on here. We were going to watch them in class that do go over a brief overview of how the war goes, but I'm going to take it upon you to do that on your own time. But I'm going to focus mainly on the things that are going to help you understand the historical trends that are provided for by College Board. So, the essential questions you have today are two. You have, to what extent was World War II fought similar to World War I? And then identify and explain the reasons why the Allied powers, which is the United States, UK, and USSR as the big three, won the war over the Axis powers, which is Germany, Italy, and Japan. All right, so the historical trend is World War II was a total war. It was governments used a variety of strategies, including political propaganda, art, media, and intensified forms of nationalism to mobilize populations, both at home and home countries and colonies or former colonies, for the purpose of waging war. Governments used ideologies, including fascism, communism, to mobilize all totalitarian states to repress basic freedoms and dominate many aspects of daily life during the course of conflicts and beyond. That is a lot of stuff that's going on in this particular historical trend. So we're going to break it down a little bit more simply. So we're going to talk about a little bit of the difference between communism and fascism. Now, you have this here. You're welcome to use this as a guide, and this is more specific, but let's talk about more of an overview here. This circle kind of gives you a sense. So, like, while communism and fascism are complete opposites of the political spectrum, there is some things that often people think that they have in common with each other that makes them similar. And there's some similarities. Number one, they kind of focus on this idea of societal well-being, but both of them have very different views of what societal well-being looks like. Both of them are extremely anti-democratic. And, the idea of the horseshoe theory is that politics are all very similar, and you start in the middle here and then you eventually kind of go back around, meaning that the further away from the middle you get and further away from centrist governments, the more authoritarian you end up becoming. So communism and fascism are extraordinarily authoritarian systems of government and in economics as well. And so, one of the things is that the state controls resources. Now, fascism is their goals are to kind of create national glory. It's all a very nationalistic, where communism is not so much about nationalism as is about classism. In fascism, they have a very rigid class system. Think about Adolf Hitler, where he believed that there were races that were just naturally superior to the others and such, like the Aryans. So thinks this very rigid social class structure. And then they support private enterprises, as we talked about the corporate fascist state in previous lectures. I think it was 7.3 or 7.4, apologies. But they do believe in private enterprises, but those private enterprises almost become like subservience to the state themselves. Communism, the goal of it is to create economic equality oftentimes, so they want to create a classless society, which, while that is the goal in practice, it never really comes to fruition the way that was envisioned by Marx. But, that's something to unpack for another time. They also believe in, or they oppose private industry. Everything is publicly owned. So the government provides, the government ran by the people provides all the things that are necessary, because in their minds, like, private businesses lead to class divisions, which then, goes against what communism is trying to get and gain, right? All right, so we're going to look at 4 examples of how the war was conducted by, two sides of the war. We're going to look at first the Western democracies and what they did in order to help win, and then we'll look at some totalitarian governments as well, because they all are going to have different strategies in winning this war. So let's start with Great Britain, and the Great Britain under Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill is going to take control of or become prime minister following the failures of Neville Chamberlain and his ability to get Hitler to not invade places, and some military operations that were disasters, in particular what happened in Norway. But that is something that the videos I will link will go into a little more detail about. But Winston Churchill becomes the new prime minister. Winston Churchill was very much opposed to the idea of appeasement with Adolf Hitler, which we talked about with the Munich conference, how Adolf Hitler wanted Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and the Allies agreed to give it to him as long as he didn't invade Czechoslovakia, and he went ahead and did it anyway and started demanding for more land. So appeasement clearly was a disaster of a policy, but Winston Churchill was very much against that, which made him really somebody in line to take over. In conducting World War II, there's a good book that just came out by Eric Layson called The Splendid and the Vile, and it goes through a lot of what Winston Churchill did during the days where he took over and the early days of World War II. But anyway, I'm digressing and creating a mess. But propaganda was definitely something that would be used to instill the sense of nationalism, to make sure people were staying calm. This is a very famous poster. It becomes much more famous later on, but the Keep Calm and Carry On was simply to try to create this sense of everything's okay, yes, the war is happening. Yes, we're being bombed, but life will continue as normal as possible, right? They would also mobilize their economy and accelerate production, especially for planes in the battle for Britain. It was very important for them to continue to build planes as they were getting shot down, and they would be able to replace them and then some very quickly and put men in the air to fight against the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, as they continued to bomb targets and cities within the British Isles. So they also look to mobilize their economy under the guidance and centralized control of production by the government. So the government created guidelines and quotas that they needed to meet to try to outproduce the Axis powers. This is something that's going to be a significant reason for why the Allies will eventually win. At the same time, while the United States is declared neutrality at the beginning of the war, there's going to be appeal made to America that they need to join the war. They are the last great democracy left at that point when the UK is the last one left in Europe. They look to the West and America to eventually bring help, which they will eventually, and we'll talk about that when we get to the United States. They also encourage rationing of vital resources, fuel, rubber, things that the Brits needed to help fight the war, and things that were normally luxuries for Brits, will be limited. Then, of course, they also are going to be bent on protecting their colonies. And the colonies are important because of the soldiers and resources that they can get from them. Just like in World War I, those colonies will play a significant role in helping them defeat the Axis powers. Okay. Then we move to the United States under Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, is in this precarious position where a majority of Americans are not eager to join World War II, and America had been practicing something called isolationism for the better parts since World War I. And they didn't feel like they needed to get dragged into wars. And so in the 1930s, there's a series of laws that were passed known as the Neutrality Act, starting in 35. There's 35, 36, 37, and 39. Each one of them reaffirmed that America will not sell weapons to warring countries or give loans or allow people to travel freely into warring countries out of fear that they would get dragged into a war similar to what happens in World War I. And especially in 1935, there was a congressional committee that investigated that America was brought into the war because arms dealers in America thought that it would help increase their profits, so they pressured the government to do so. While that was not the only reason for why they joined, it certainly was something that gave Americans pause to whether or not we should help the Brits. After a while, though, it becomes very apparent that Hitler is a bad guy. We need friends in the world, and one of our last remaining democracies is the UK. So they began to give things weapons. Starting with the destroyer for bases deal, where they strike a deal with the British and give them the 50 old destroyers, ships of ours that weren't very good, but the British needed them very badly. And then the Brits would give us leases to bases around the world. So this kind of gave our naval power more mobility because we had places to fuel up and so forth. In 1941, though, we go all out and do the Lend-Lease Act, which would start giving weapons and all matters of supplies for war to not just the British, but also the Soviet Union later on and the Chinese, who were fighting against the Japanese. But it wasn't until Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the naval base and Pacific Fleet base in Hawaii, as the Japanese are going to try to knock out the Americans out of the war to begin with. Really, what they did was awaken a sleeping giant. And so, in conducting World War II, we have manpower in terms of number of soldiers. We have women power in terms of people who are going to help with production, and women play a significant role in helping America and its allies win the war because of the amount of stuff we produce. And that's really what this war is going to be coming down to. And one of the major reasons why the Allies win is because they are able to outproduce the Axis powers. And so the propaganda is something that will be done once again to instill nationalism, a sense of duty to the country and why they need to fight. Or build stuff or whatever, ration. The poster you see here, let me get myself out of the way. It's one of my favorite propaganda posters is when you ride alone with Hitler. So basically, if you don't, carpool and conserve gasoline, then you are not helping out with the war effort. So that's something that they promoted, right? There's much more centralized control of government or production that the government oversees of, where vital resources are going. Rationing will be something that goes on in the United States. Women and minorities are filling in jobs and industrial and agricultural jobs to make sure that industry and food production stays high and increases in America. And of course, they're selling war bonds and raising taxes, encouraging people to help not just invest in their own financial futures, but also to invest in the future of their country. But the wartime economies of the Axis versus the Allies, the Axis powers will not get even close to out producing what the Allies are able to do. In large part is because of American industries that were generally protected and not bombed because they had an ocean that kind of kept that distance, and either Japanese or Germans had the technology to be able to get close enough to bomb American factories. All right, but in totalitarian states like Germany, German aggression really is what is going to undo the Treaty of Versailles. And in Hitler's desire for Lebensraum, which is living space, led to that aggressive takeover of Europe. And so the Nazis themselves would use propaganda. They would hold rallies to, whip up their people into a frenzy. I don't want to be over Hitler's. Yeah, I just disassociate there. They want to, they had posters, especially targeting, portions of their populations that they thought were not German and undesirables. They controlled all news information. The propaganda, they had their own propaganda minister, a guy named Goebbels. His first name is slipping my mind, but they controlled the message 100% of the way and told the German people a number of lies to kind of indicate that they were on the side of good and other things. But that's going to happen. And so in Germany, as well as Germany takes over more parts of Europe, there's going to be mass incarcerations of people who were considered undesirables. This is going to lead to the genocide known as the Holocaust, something we're going to dive into a lot more specific with topic 7.8, which talks about mass atrocities. And the Holocaust is one that I will talk the most detail about and how that unfolds. But they'd also use the fascist corporate state, private businesses that are supported by the states in order to increase production, building tanks and planes and all sorts of things. The other thing that why the Germans were successful in taking over Europe is because of a new tactic known as blitzkrieg, which is lightning war in German. The basic principle of how it works is that you bomb targets to soften them up, and then you use heavy armor and light armor to very quickly move in to not let the enemy dig in. And so the key to this was speed and overwhelming force, and it prevents another World War I happening where things get bogged down into trenches and quagmires, right? And then something else that the Germans do is that once they take over a lot of these states, they begin to put puppet governments in that are vaguely under the control of the Nazis, but they seem to think that they have the appearance of being independent, but it's not even close. And so a good example of that was the Vichy French government, which were essentially French Nazis who were supportive of Adolf Hitler, and they had certain sovereignty over their country, but at the end of the day, the Vichys were fighting with the Nazis themselves. All right, and I'm not putting myself near Stalin's head either. Okay, so Hitler is going to break the non-aggression pact with Stalin in June 1941, and he will invade the Soviet Union. And at this time, the Soviet Union is still in the midst of those ideas of the 5-year plans. They're trying to industrialize their country. And the war itself, despite the fact that it's Adolf Hitler and the Soviets weren't completely trustworthy of him, when the invasion happens, they seem to be caught off guard. And it goes very poorly for the beginning of the war and what is known as Operation Barbarossa, which is the military term of the invasion. It's the largest land invasion in history. But this is going to lead to Stalin in his way of waging war. There's a lot of things that will occur. Okay, so first of all, like industrial production had increased significantly under Stalin because of those 5-year plans, and so they are going to move a lot of the production to the east, which then will build lots and lots and lots of materials that will help them win. But they focused on things like, this right here is the T-34 tank, which was a very good tank. Not as good as what the Germans were rolling out, but they could build more of them than what the Germans were able to with less resources. So overwhelming force is going to play a significant role in that. But when the beginning of the war happened as well, as they were retreating and many of their soldiers were surrendering and being encircled, they partook in what was known as the scorched earth policy, which, they would destroy farms and factories, anything that could be used by the Germans against them. And so, especially in destroying lots of crops and food and killing livestock, that scorched earth policy would lead to significant starvation and famine going on within the civilian populations of the Soviet Union. And especially true for the siege of Leningrad, which the Soviets had dug in and protected Leningrad. But because of the scorched earth policy, there was a significant lack of food. And so people starved to death, so many of them in Leningrad in the almost 4 years of being under siege. Stalin also did things to make sure that the soldiers would continue to fight no matter what the odds were, and so he ordered things like Order 270, which basically would give officers the right to shoot deserters on spot rather than having due process to give them trials. So, like in a battle, if they were retreating, that was considered desertion, and so they would turn their machine guns onto the deserters rather than the enemy. And so that is something that did happen in the Soviet Union. They also executed a ton of political prisoners in the gulags, fearing that if the Germans would get to them, then they would use them to turn against the Soviet Union. So they executed a bunch of them in that case. Then Order 227 was officers ordering retreat without Stalin's permission would be put on trial, and it would be a kangaroo court, and they'd be found guilty. But the Soviet Union, despite the fact that they play a big role in helping defeat the Axis powers, will suffer greatly under both their government and the Nazis as they roam through and take territory and kill ethnic minorities and Jews. But the Soviet Union had the greatest number of casualties. Roughly 18 million people died of the 50 to 80 million people who died in this war, and then 7 million of them were civilians. All right, I need to hurry this up. Oversimplified, 1. Oversimplified, part 2. Are 2 great videos to go over how the war goes. This picture is a very famous picture. It's the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, which is the government building, like their version of the legislature or Congress building. So it's very famous. It's kind of the victory over the Nazis picture and such. And so, yes. Right, new military technology and new tactics, including atomic bombing, firebombing, and waging of total war led to increased levels of wartime casualties. Total war was committed on both Germany and the Soviet, or Germany and Japan. In Germany, they did strategic bombing campaigns, and they would just carpet bomb areas of cities that had lots of industry, but this still created lots of civilian deaths. 2 big ones that stand out is the bombings of Hamburg and Dresden. Between the 2 of them, you have over 80,000 people, civilians, that were killed in the fire bombings themselves. Total war in Japan, also once the Americans were able to get close enough to launch bombers off of the islands that they had taken over to start bombing Japan, they do so in significant numbers. And so the firebombing of Japan, and particularly Tokyo itself, even though it's a very modern city today, it wasn't as much back then. It was, a lot of their buildings were made of wood and paper. And so the firestorms that engulfed these cities would kill significant large amounts of people. And the firebombings of Tokyo killed anywhere between 120 to 200,000 people. And then civilian deaths in Japan range from 300,000 to 900,000, depending on the source that you look at. But the United States also, after defeating Germany, are going to use the most powerful weapon ever created, which would be the atomic bomb. In July 16, 1945, the United States was able to successfully test an atomic weapon, and this new terrifying weapon would then be used on Japan to help force them to surrender. And so they dropped 2 bombs, one on the city of Hiroshima, one on the city of Nagasaki. Between the 2 bombs, the Japanese still refused to surrender, but they ultimately call war council. They have a tied vote. The emperor breaks the vote. Even after that, there was an attempted coup to try to remove the emperor before he surrenders, but he does do so. And so up to 214,000 people were killed between the 2 cities, the drop in the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And to give you some reference of bombs in history, this is the bombs that are dropped in Hiroshima. And then Trinity is the first testing bombs, but we build much, much bigger bombs, and the Soviets will eventually build a much, much, much bigger bomb. All right, so this is another little video you can watch on your own time. It's Robert McNamara's views on total war. Robert McNamara was the former Secretary of State under Kennedy and Johnson, and he oversaw the Vietnam War. So he has some very unique perspectives of what total war and committing total war looked like. And moving on. Okay. And then this is a little graph that you can look at a little more detail and such. It's of the firebombing of the cities of Japan, and then the percentage of the city destroyed, and then in parentheses, it's a comparison to the size of the city of an American city at that time. And then here are all the World War II deaths. You can see total deaths and the colors, the military deaths for red, orange is civilian, or blue as the civilian deaths and such. But you can see there's a lot of people who died from this war, and especially civilians, being a total war. Okay, so that's it. With little time to spare as my class is about to start. But this is your essential questions. Make sure you take some time to think about the responses, and don't forget to add specific examples and such. That bell means I've got to go. I'll see you all later.